Starship's 9th flight is finally upon us, and we have a lot to talk about thanks to SpaceX's usual pre-launch updates. We've also seen more launch pad testing, vehicle rollouts and rollbacks, high bay demolitions, and to cap it all off, it seems that SpaceX could be getting ready to build another Starship launch tower. Yep, you heard me right. We've got all of that and much more coming up in this Starbase update. Let's start off at the Starbase launch site, where teams have continued with the load testing of Pad B's chopsticks. Yes, the big water bags. But don't think this was just more of the same, because this second round of testing involved even more of these water bags hanging from the chopsticks, so that means even more weight put on the arms and therefore increased stress on their structure. Given what we saw, it seems like the maximum load on the chopsticks might have been around 700 tons, which is quite a lot of margin compared to the mass of a recently landed Starship booster or ship. That is not super surprising though, as we saw the same kind of testing back when Pad A's chopsticks were installed. That was all the way back in 2021, if you want to feel old. On top of that extra weight, for this round of testing, these load bags were hanging a lot lower from the chopsticks than the previous round of testing. This is something that actually diverges from what we saw during the Pad A chopstick testing, as in that case all the testing was done with the load bags closer to the chopstick arms. A potential reason for this change is that they've learned from Pad A's catches that they need this modified kind of testing. The weights being lower might even better simulate the mass distribution of a recently caught booster, since most of the mass would be at the aft end of the vehicle around the engines. Speaking of Pad B, in recent days we've observed a drilling rig working on each side of the flame trench, probably preparing those areas for new concrete foundations. It is believed that SpaceX will put a lot of concrete on each side of the trench in order to protect the ground from the force of the exhaust that will be generated by the Super Heavy booster. You definitely don't want to end up with concrete eroding and flying everywhere. We've seen how that story ends before. This week, SpaceX also made even more progress on the dismantling of the high bay. If you've been watching for the last few weeks, you might have seen that instead of bringing it all down in one go, they've been carefully taking it apart piece by piece, cutting one piece at a time. This has also involved making cutouts on each of the sections to make it easier to take it apart and not having the wind push the pieces one way or the other. These huge sheets of metal can act like a sail in the wind, which can be less than helpful. In the final stretch of the demolition, teams began to completely cut out the panels from the walls of the building, leaving a very short and hollowed out version of the high bay structure. If you're wondering why they did this, well, here's why. If you recall, back when SpaceX demolished the mid-bay, the procedure was very similar. Weaken the base of the structure and pull it from that point, so it all comes down in a controlled manner. But of course, the mid-bay was a lot shorter than the high bay, so this couldn't be done with the entire high bay structure, hence why this didn't happen until this point. With the high bay gone and having previously removed the Star Factory Western Extension and the Stargate buildings, SpaceX can now proceed to build the Starbase Giga Bay. It is in this exact area where the building is expected to go, so it won't be a surprise if in the next few days or weeks we see SpaceX starting foundation work. This work will take a while though, because not only is the Giga Bay a lot larger than the high bay or the mega bays, but it is also expected to be constructed differently to those facilities. A way of knowing just how different it'll be is to go and look at the one that SpaceX is currently building at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This one started construction quite a few months earlier, so it's further ahead than the one at Starbase. Our friend Anthony Imoli recently flew over the Space Coast and captured images of the progress at the Giga Bay, which, as you can see, has gotten significantly ahead compared to the last time we flew over. These foundations are quite sturdy, as we expect the construction of this Giga Bay and the Starbase Giga Bay to feature more traditional construction elements, perhaps with concrete walls instead of metal walls, internal structural frames instead of exterior structural frames, and much more. After all, these structures are meant to last for quite a while, as SpaceX intends to host at least 24 work cells in each Giga Bay. That's quite the commitment. The tougher and sturdier, the longer they'll last. While we're here at Florida's Space Coast, we of course have to mention one other thing that we observed while looking through Anthony's photos. Do you remember when SpaceX used to build Starship tower sections here at Roberts Road? Back in 2022, SpaceX used this site to build all of the sections for the Starship launch tower at LC-39A, and also 7 of the 9 sections of the Starship launch tower at Starbase's Pad B. In the case of the latter, the completed tower sections had to be barged from Florida to Texas, while the rest were built on site. These tower sections were built on steel stands, which were all resting on concrete footings in the ground. In fact, you can see a bunch of those stands resting on the old concrete footings in Anthony's photos. But if we move further south, you may notice SpaceX has started building new concrete footings closer to the tent, where it is building the launch mount for the 39A Starship pad. Just this indication alone means that SpaceX still intends to build more Starship towers in Florida. Otherwise, why build more of these footings in the first place? One could say that maybe they're just repositioning the tower construction from the old site to this newer location, and the older site may be redeveloped for something else. But it could also be that they're building new footings to build a new tower. After all, the number of existing footings doesn't match the number of sections for a Starship tower. That is mainly because ever since 2023, a bunch of the old footings were removed and covered with other work and remodeling at the site. So if they want to build an entirely new Starship tower, they need to build more of these footings. The idea that more Starship towers are on the way shouldn't be a huge surprise, given that SpaceX intends to use Space Launch Complex 37, just down the road at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, as another Starship launch site with perhaps 1 or 2 launch pads and maybe even its own catch tower. Official documentation also shows SpaceX eventually intends to build a dedicated catch tower at Launch Complex 39A as well. What's even more interesting is that the next Starship tower to be built might not be too far away. It all has to do with these pieces of hardware at the old tower construction site. These 4 pieces over here are part of the construction of the first section of the tower, that is, the one that goes right above the concrete base of the tower. These 4 pieces were not present at Roberts Road when our NSF Cape team flew back in April, so these being there now could indicate that we may see new tower construction starting not too long from now. Of course, we'll just have to wait and see if all of this comes true or if this is just wishful thinking, but it's quite interesting nonetheless. And of course, a big thanks to Anthony for allowing us to use his pictures, and once all the Starship Flight 9 chaos is behind us, our own Cape team will be back in the air soon for a full Space Coast update episode. Let's follow in the footsteps of our field team and head to Starbase because, as you would probably imagine, with a Starship launch right around the corner, a lot of things have had to happen to prepare for it. For example, over the last few days, we've seen lots of activity at Starbase's Pad A. The Pad A side of the tank farm came back to life for a few hours on May 22nd, with frost and venting visible on the propellant transfer lines as well as the subcoolers. That round of pad testing also included a bunch of purges of the booster quick disconnect, which will be used to feed Booster 14 with all of the consumables needed for its upcoming flight. Apart from the tank farm and launch mount testing, SpaceX teams have also tested the chopstick arms at the Pad A launch tower. It seems like it wasn't enough to just test the set at Pad B, they also had to test the ones at Pad A, even though Booster 14 won't be caught. I'm still a little bit disappointed about that, I can't lie. All of these tests are fundamental for SpaceX to know whether these systems will work or not once launch day comes. The launch pad is obviously important, but you can't launch Starship without a Starship. As we suspected last week, Ship 35's testing hadn't ended with the 6-engine 60-second duration static fire that took place all the way back on May 12th. That feels like an eternity ago. Just a few days ago, on May 21st, Ship 35 took to Highway 4 once again, rolling out to Massey's for a 3rd round of engine testing. This time though, the ship was much more complete, with further progress on its thermal protection system than what we had seen when it went to Massey's on the previous occasion. Our team had also spotted, prior to that rollout, the orange placard at the entrance of Mega Bay 2 that warns of the presence of explosives inside the building, thus indicating that, most likely, Ship 35's flight termination system charges were now installed. In fact, once Ship 35 arrived at Massey's, another explosives placard was seen at the entrance to the facility, further confirming that Ship 35 had its FTS charges installed. The day after rollout, May 22nd, Ship 35 went into testing really early in the morning, getting quite frosty in the process. However, other than frost and venting, no visible test was observed. In fact, we never got to see a full load of liquid oxygen on the ship's LOX tank, indicating that perhaps whatever test they planned had been cut short during the liquid oxygen load. SpaceX teams reset for another try later that evening, and finally, roughly 23 minutes past 8 local time, we saw an amazing spin prime. I know, spin prime, it's not the most visually exciting test, but trust me, you don't want a spin prime to get visually exciting. We're not going to show the Booster 7 spin prime again. With the spin prime completed, SpaceX rolled Ship 35 back to the production site for final preparations. One of those preparations included removing the ship from the mobile engine test stand, aka the crab stand, and putting it on a regular transport stand. Teams also prepared the vehicle to receive the 8 Starlink simulators set to fly on this upcoming Starship flight. We'll go into the details of that in just a moment. After some initial delay getting the Starlink simulators up into the ship's payload bay, the first one finally went in during the late afternoon of May 24th, even if Booster 14 decided to briefly block our view of it. As for Booster 14 itself, well, it was pretty much ready, and if you watched our previous Starbase update episode, it had in fact been at the launch site for what we thought was going to be the last time. But for whatever reason, it rolled back to Mega Bay 1, and so of course for it to fly it has to, roll back out to the launch site, which it did a little while later. Overnight, it was rolled to the pad, where it was lifted by the chopsticks onto the orbital launch mount. Following the Ship 35 spin prime and ahead of the upcoming Starship flight, SpaceX released an update on its website explaining what happened on Flight 8 and the result of their own investigation. The vehicles that flew the previous flight were Booster 15 and Ship 34. As you will probably recall, Booster 15 successfully lifted off with all 33 engines running and completed its entire ascent burn without issue. Starship went through hot staging, after which the booster flipped around and was able to relight 8 out of the 10 engines on its middle ring of engines. Booster 15 successfully executed its entry through the atmosphere and lit up 12 out of the 13 center engines for landing, including one that hadn't relit at the time of the boost back burn. As we all saw, Booster 15 was successfully caught by the launch tower after a roughly 7-minute flight with seemingly no issues. Now, SpaceX did explain in its update why some of the Raptors did not relight. SpaceX says that the most probable cause was, quote, traced to torch ignition issues on the individual engines caused by thermal conditions local to the igniter. Post-flight testing was able to replicate the issue, and engines on future flights will have additional insulation as mitigation. If you remember back to Starship's 7th flight, one of the Raptor engines on Booster 14's boost back burn also did not relight, and back then SpaceX also said it was due to a torch igniter issue, more specifically due to a low power condition. Sounds almost as if relighting what can be considered the most complex chemical rocket engine while your vehicle is doing rocket gymnastics is a hard thing to do. Anyways, for Flight 8, we knew the booster worked. The booster teams were probably very happy that day, but of course it was the ship that ended its flight quite short of its goals. At hot staging, Ship 34 ignited all of its Raptor engines successfully and initiated its ascent burn into its planned trajectory towards the Indian Ocean. But as we saw from the onboard camera views, this was cut short when about 5.5 minutes into the burn there was a violent engine explosion and several engines went out. SpaceX says on its update that a flash was seen near one of the Raptor sea level engines, which led to an explosion that took out the engine. This then forced a shutdown of the remaining sea-level Raptor engines and one Raptor vacuum engine, leading to a loss of control of the vehicle. Similar to Flight 7, contact was lost with the ship prior to triggering any of the destruct rules for the autonomous flight termination system, although it is assumed that once communication was lost, this system was triggered. Ship 34 then ended up re-entering over the Atlantic Ocean, south of the Bahamas and near the Turks and Caicos. SpaceX said that, quote, SpaceX worked closely with the Bahamian government and sent a team of experts to coordinate and execute cleanup efforts. All debris came down within the pre-planned debris response area, and there were no hazardous materials present in the debris and no significant impacts expected to occur to marine species or water quality. As a result of the ship failure, SpaceX started a mishap investigation. As a reminder, even though the FAA announces these, it's actually SpaceX that leads them. According to SpaceX, quote, the most probable root cause for the loss of Starship was identified as a hardware failure in one of the upper stage's center Raptor engines that resulted in inadvertent propellant mixing and ignition. So this doesn't at all sound like what happened on Flight 7, and in fact later in the update, SpaceX also says that while both issues on Flight 7 and 8 occurred at a similar moment in flight, the two failures are distinctly different. SpaceX even goes on to say that up until the failure happened, all the mitigations from Flight 7 worked well during Ship 34's flight. That being said, it would be interesting to have more details on what sort of hardware failure occurred to that center sea-level Raptor engine on Ship 34 that ended its life prematurely. That statement, taken literally, almost seems to imply that it happened by chance and that it could have happened on any other prior ship or booster just as easily. If true, this would put Raptor's reliability into question, but also the capability of the engine shielding to prevent a vehicle failure if an engine goes away in a violent way. It's something that Elon has in fact mentioned multiple times in the past. Having so many engines only works if there's proper isolation from the other engines. However, there must be more to it than just chance, as SpaceX says they did quite a lot of ground testing to understand this failure. This included more than 100 long-duration firings of Raptor engines at the company's engine test facilities in McGregor. In hindsight, it feels now rather on point that a couple of months ago we decided to include updates about McGregor testing on these episodes, all thanks to our McGregor Live 24/7 stream. Ever since we started including McGregor updates on Starbase Update, you might have noticed us discussing a series of really interesting tests that had caught our eye in the last couple of months. A few weeks after Flight 8, we started seeing a certain pattern in the burn time of certain Raptor tests taking place at the McGregor horizontal stand. All of them had a similar burn duration time of 370 to 374 seconds. In total, we observed 34 burns with this duration, the first one taking place on March 17th, just 11 days after Flight 8. The last of these types of tests took place on May 22nd, the day right before SpaceX released their update. It's worth pointing out that those 370 to 334-second tests roughly translate into 6 minutes and 10 seconds to 6 minutes and 14 seconds, which is very similar to the burn duration of the ship's engines during ascent. Taking those rather peculiar tests into account, plus several other long-duration tests occurring at McGregor, we found at least 106 Raptor tests longer than 100 seconds in duration since Flight 8 and the time of the SpaceX update. Not all of these might have been Raptor 2 engines though, as most of the stands at the facility are now solely dedicated to testing Raptor 3, so perhaps SpaceX's cutoff for what to consider a long-duration burn might be lower than 100 seconds. This extensive testing could explain some of the fiery endings that we see for some of these tests in the last couple of months. Speaking of which, we also saw quite the fireball at the South Raptor stand a few days ago. I'm very curious to find out what that was all about. Apart from all the testing at McGregor to find the issue, SpaceX also said that, quote, to address the issues on upcoming flights, engines on the Starship's upper stage will receive additional preload on key joints, a new nitrogen purge system, and improvements to the propellant drain system. So with Flight 8's failure identified and corrected, what's up with Flight 9? Well, in general terms, it's still a very similar flight profile to Flight 7 and 8, but there are changes, especially for the booster. Unlike on the previous flights, this will be the first time SpaceX reflies a Super Heavy booster. Booster 14 will be flying for a second time on this mission, but it will also be its last launch. SpaceX confirmed on its website that they don't intend to catch Booster 14 on this flight. The reason for this is that they intend to carry out experiments on this booster's return, and it would be too risky to carry those out while returning the vehicle back to the launch site. After stage separation, Booster 14 will perform a partial boost back burn and start its entry through the atmosphere. This entry, unlike on previous entries, will have a higher angle of attack. That means the booster will be flying much more horizontally than we're used to. This, in turn, uses the vehicle's own body to generate lift and extends the glide distance of the booster. This entry profile also decreases the descent speed and therefore the amount of propellant needed for the landing burn. That landing burn will also be different this time around. SpaceX says that they will intentionally disable one of the 3 center engines on Super Heavy for the landing burn to gather data on the ability for one of the engines in the middle ring of 10 engines to be used as a backup to complete a landing burn. For the end of the landing burn though, the plan is to transition to just the 2 central engines and coming to a stop while still high above the water. SpaceX says Super Heavy is expected to make a hard splashdown this mission, as opposed to boosters 11 and 13, which had a soft splashdown, and they ended up blowing up only after they tipped over. Another really interesting change for this booster's flight is in the hot staging maneuver. SpaceX says that previous boost back flips were done in random orientations, just based on wherever the ship's engine exhaust happened to push against the booster each flight. This time around though, they've intentionally blocked one portion of the hot staging ring, which will cause the ship's exhaust to push against the booster in a controlled direction. SpaceX states that this will require less propellant to be reserved for return, and more that can be used on ascent instead, leading to a slight boost in mass to orbit capability. As for what will happen to Ship 35, well, we're hoping to finally see all of the new Block 2 upgrades get completely tested on this flight. A lot of these upgrades include the thermal protection system, which includes new and tougher tiles compared to Block 1. On this flight, SpaceX is once again flying several material experiments, including metallic tiles and an actively cooled tile. Just like on Flight 7 and 8, SpaceX also removed several tiles in key locations of the ship to stress test those areas during re-entry. One interesting thing to note though is that only one side of the heat shield has these missing tiles, probably to A/B test one side against the other during re-entry. Part of the Block 2 upgrades also include the redesigned forward flaps, which have been moved further up and leeward on the ship's nose cone. This should prevent any issues with the plasma seeping through the gap between the vehicle's hull and the flap, as it is no longer directly in the path of the plasma. On Flight 7 and 8, SpaceX also tried to test a tapered edge to the heat shield on some portions of the sides of the vehicle, but on Flight 9, this has been applied to both sides of the vehicle on its entire length. Previous ships also included patches of what appear to be ablative material beyond those tapered heat shield tiles, but this now also seems to go down the entire length of the ship. Unlike on ships 33 and 34, ship 35 includes real catch pins that have actually been used inside Mega Bay 2 to lift the ship with the bay's bridge crane. The protective ramps on the side of the ship also seem to have been further strengthened and have seen ablative material applied to them. Ship 35 will once again attempt to deploy Starlink simulators, but this time it'll be 8 instead of the 10 on ship 33 and the 4 on ship 34. The ship will also attempt to perform an in-space relight of one of its Raptor engines to demonstrate Starship's ability to modify its orbit, including future deorbit bands. As of the time of recording, SpaceX is targeting launch of Starship's 9th flight no earlier than May 27th at 18:30 Central Time. That's 23:30 UTC. Based on hazard notices, it appears the length of the launch window for this flight might be approximately 90 minutes in duration. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk intends to carry out a live Starship presentation roughly 6.5 hours prior to launch. The talk, dubbed The Road to Making Life Multiplanetary, seems like it might make heavy references to the intention by the company of sending Starship vehicles to Mars within the 2026 planetary transfer window. The quote, Mars 2026 company talk that one can find on SpaceX's website when using Inspect Element is certainly quite a big clue. Trust me, nothing gets by the NSF team. We'll have to wait and see whether Elon will give some sort of detail on specific testing needed for that mission and the timelines that they're working with. If one were to write a wish list of sorts for this talk, that's definitely very high up on the list. It would also be interesting to see a more comprehensive explanation of what sort of upgrades we could expect on the upcoming version of boosters and ships, and perhaps maybe finally see a SpaceX video of a Raptor 3 firing at McGregor. So far, we've only seen photos from last summer. The only way to find out will be to tune into the talk. Here at NSF will be live at the time for our Starship Flight 9 stakeout stream, which is set to begin 12 hours prior to the opening of the launch window. You can be sure during that live stream we'll be discussing what Elon announces in this company talk. And of course, don't forget to tune into our dedicated Starship Flight 9 launch broadcast starting 4 hours prior to the launch window opening. There is just one more thing to know, and it's that there's a transport closure scheduled for May 28th, right after the flight. The closure notice states that the transport will be from the factory to Massey's, which could mean a ship heading out for testing. Earlier this week, we saw a few Raptor engines going into Mega Bay 2, which perhaps might have been installed on Ship 36, the ship set for Flight 10. So one option that the transport closure could be that SpaceX will enter turbo mode if Flight 9 succeeds, and they'll immediately roll Ship 36 out for engine testing at the Massey's test site. But it could also be that instead they'll roll Ship 37 to Massey's for cryogenic proof testing, which will kickstart the pre-flight campaign for Starship Flight 11. It's surreal that we're nearly at double-digit flights of full-stack Starships. For now though, we'll see you tomorrow for the 9th flight test of the most powerful rocket ever manufactured. I've been Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.